So Martha Carucci is a friend of a lot of you all, I know. Is a friend of mine, and she's our guest tonight. So would you welcome her up? Just in the nick of time. Look at that. Family just got here. So the story she just read, a lot of people forget because we put it on the altar table and we kind of sacramentalize it. But when Adam and Eve sin in the garden, God's response is to tell Adam that by the sweat of your brow, now you'll have to make bread. And so bread starts out as a reminder of Adam and Eve's shortcomings. And now in this story, it's a symbol of both their complaining, but also God's grace, that God is providing for them every day in a way that is enough and is also undeserved. And I want you to take that as your launching pad to go.
Great. Well, first of all, I want to say thanks for having me, Jason. This is just really a thrill for me to be able to sit here with you. I put on Facebook that I was going to be doing this, and I said that I'm getting to sit down with one of my true heroes, and it's true. You've been an inspiration to me, and you've been a great support to me, and I'm really, really happy to have this opportunity to speak with you today and to sit here. When we had this long preparation for this tonight, Jason just told me what the scripture was going to be about and take it from there. So I thought about the reading a little bit, and can everybody hear me okay? Okay. He really likened it to the fact that, and what I took from it was that, God provided just what the Israelites needed for the day and was very specific in his instructions, like don't save it for the next day, because when he would see who was listening to him and who wasn't following, because the manna turned bad and was filled with maggots, and the next day it wasn't good for them. So it was very strict and very clear that I will provide you with what you need for today. And in my personal journey, I have found that God has given me what I need just for the day, and take that and run with it for the day, and that I don't have to worry about tomorrow. And for many of us, I think whatever it is that we're dealing with in our lives, the idea of looking forward and looking at the concept of forever in dealing with an illness or a disease or just difficult times that you're going through personally, the concept of this is going to last forever is just so overwhelming. So that's why in the recovery world, there's a very trite saying, but it's one day at a time. And I think that can be applied to so many things in our lives. And the scripture reading is a good reminder of that. Just one day, just focus on today. And I think the state of the world today, it's a great reminder for all of us to be more present and just focus on today.
So you alluded to the word recovery. So talk about your journey. How did you get here?
Here specifically because I bored you to death one day on a school bus. Poor Jason had to sit next to me. Our boys were on a field trip.
It wasn't boring, but I make jokes about how people find out what I do for a living, and then that just provokes all kinds of conversations, and that's exactly what it did.
Well, for whatever reason, I just kind of unleashed, on you and just shared with you my story, and it was pretty early into my sobriety. I don't remember exactly when, but I shared with you what I was going through, that in May of 2012, on May 28th to be exact, which was 1,979 days ago, in case anyone was curious. Not that I keep track. But I told you that, I had realized that my life had become unmanageable, that alcohol had taken over, and that I had a serious problem with drinking. And I presented myself to the outside world as a normal mom living in the suburbs. I was a lobbyist. I had 3 kids, and everybody from the outside looked at me and thought, what could possibly be wrong? And in the inside, I was suffering miserably. And so I shared with you that story on the bus that day, and I started to write. I started to write a blog, and I realized that it was extremely cathartic for me to be able to write, but what I wanted to do with it more was to be able to share my story so that I could help other people who were going through it. I started this blog in January of 2013, and I kept it anonymous for a year. It was just my writing, just a little bit about my journey, and just kind of a way to share my thoughts about, the first Christmas I went through sober, the first, cocktail party I had to go to, the first event that I had to speak at in public for work when I used to be, just relied upon having some liquid courage before I walked into a room. So it was a lot of firsts. And you talked to me about, can I interview you for the congregation for a sermon that I'm doing, a series on the 7 deadly sins. And we met at Starbucks, your other office over there on Route 1, and with the Frappuccino machines going loudly, we had this, this conversation. And when you said you were going to play it for the congregation one day anonymously, I talked to my husband and I said, Jason wants to interview me and he'll play it anonymous. No one will know it's me. And he thought about it for a minute. And, he's a retired Navy officer and I think a very private man. And he just quietly said to me, if you think that this is important for you to try to help other people with this, then why don't you forego the anonymity? And so you were very instrumental in me coming out about my recovery. So I'm grateful for that. But you played my voice in the middle of the sermon. That was absolutely one of my favorite sermons that you've done. I listened to your podcasts on your website, and it was called 1 cross plus 3 nails equals forever, forgiven. Mm. And I don't know if any of you remember this, but Jason shared the story of how great writers start their writing and what kind of practice and techniques they use. And he shared about Hemingway and and you said that you like to come down in your boxers and your cup of coffee and you start your writing. And one morning...
You've taken this interview over now.
Sorry. All right, go ahead. Ask me a question.
Where are you going with this?
Well, like I said, we had a lot of preparation time. You said that your wife and kids had gone out and they had... you heard a knock at the door and you thought that it was them, they forgot something, but it was some Jehovah's Witnesses. And they came and told you that, did you know that if you die tomorrow, you could go to hell? And you said, well, I don't really believe that. And they said, well, honey, you need to talk to your pastor. And you said, well, I am a pastor. And they said, you look far too young. But they've went on to say that, Jesus died on the cross so that you'll be free in heaven. And you disagreed with that and said, I believe that Jesus died on the cross so that we will be free in this life. And that's kind of where I came into the conversation, and you played my conversation with you, my dialogue, and said, listen to my friend talk about the freedom that she has in this life because she's broken the chains of addiction and is living free from bondage of alcoholism and a terrible life that was just, going down in a downward spiral.
So when did you first know that you were a prisoner to that?
When it became something that was not just for fun anymore, it was something that was a daily necessity. It was, going out to cocktail parties and friends' houses and drinking, that was normal. But then when it became, I couldn't wait until the clock hit 5 so that I could open a bottle of wine and make dinner for my family, and then that bottle would be finished before I knew it, and I'd hide it from my husband, so when he come home from work, he didn't know that I had already had a whole bottle. So I saw the decline, and I saw that it was becoming much more of a crutch and not a Band-Aid.
Did anyone else see it?
They did. People had made comments to me. I was really unhappy inside, and I struggled with depression, and I would take antidepressants and wash them down with alcohol, which I always wondered why they didn't work. And then, I would go to therapists, and therapists would say to me, a lot of what you talk about seems to involve alcohol. And I was like, no, that has nothing to do with it. And I just figured they had no idea what they were talking about, and it was time to find a new therapist. But, my mom said to me, there's a lot of drinking, and I dismissed that too. I knew in my heart and deep inside, I knew it was a problem, but it was the life that I knew. It was what I was used to and how I was used to living, and I didn't want to give it up.
St. Paul takes this language from the book of Exodus, and he uses it to talk about the other ways that we're bound, and he uses the power of sin. But he makes, what that's about is that we talk about freedom in terms of having choices. But what you're describing is, you have choices, but really you're not making free choices. That like you have the choice to buy this bottle of wine, but really you're a prisoner at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that the night in New York City that I sat with my best friend and talked about this, we had an argument about choice. And she lost her husband to alcoholism. He died from the disease. And she said he had a choice, and he got to the crossroads and he took the wrong path. And I said he didn't have a choice because he had this disease that was making the choice for him. And since I've gotten sober, I can see her point of view, and I wrote a piece called The Power of Choice. I believe that we have the choice up until we pick up the drink. And then once you pick up the drink, if you're an alcoholic, you lose your ability to choose.
And is that ability to choose, is it easier now for you than because 2012, I mean, that's almost 5 years ago.
Yeah, 1,979 days. The choice is much easier now. It was very, very hard in the beginning. It was very hard. But I made the choice to stay away from everybody, to stay in my house, just to like recover. And then gradually, friends kind of rallied around me and got me out. And the choice now is much easier because, and this is really important for people to know who are currently going through something really hard, whether it's alcoholism or addiction or just a rough situation. It's so much better on the other side. And you're the only person who can make the choice to do something about, recovery or addiction, but you don't have to do it alone. There's so much support out there, and I was blessed with a great deal of support and a great deal of strength from other people.
Was there ever a period where you were, because like God's just rescued them and now they're already complaining about how they liked it better where they were before? Were you ever in that same position? Like, where you're like, it was a lot easier being a prisoner?
Sure. There were so many times when I thought about picking up a drink and just saying it was so much easier when I didn't have to feel the feelings that I was feeling because I was used to numbing everything. I was like, wow, I don't want to feel this. I don't want to go through this struggle. This is really difficult. But my friend, I would say to her, I don't think I can do this anymore. And she's like, go ahead, pick up a drink. The last time I held my husband's hand, it was cold. So that was kind of rough to hear.
Yeah. I don't even, attention getting. What's this been like for your family?
Oh, I would love to have them come up and tell you themselves, but I won't put them on the spot. When I first got sober, the only one that's old enough to really, I think, understand and remember is my daughter, who was 10, a little over 10 when I got sober. And I talked about after you asked me to be interviewed for the congregation, and I talked to my husband, and he said, why don't you forego the anonymity? I talked to her, and I said, what would you think, or how would you feel if one of your friends or somebody at school said to you, your mom's an alcoholic, or your mom has this problem? And she thought for just a second, and then she said, I would tell them that my mom used to drink a lot, and she doesn't anymore, and I'm really proud of her. And that was all I needed to hear. And in the beginning, when it was really hard, like you said, did I ever think about going back and it was easier? There were so many times when I thought about it being easier when I could drink. She would realize, like in a social situation, that I was uncomfortable, and she'd look at me and say, are you okay? And I was like, oh yeah, I'm fine. And she would go and get me like a seltzer with a lime or like a fun drink. And all of them have been an amazing support to me. My husband has been there for me every day, and when I first told him I had a problem, since that moment he's been by my side, and that's just not something I take for granted at all.
When you first told me, one of the things I realized was when your addiction is anonymous to those around you, that makes everyone around you unwittingly an enabler, and how so much of our social lives in our communities, especially in this community, is centered around alcohol. That we're putting chains on you without realizing.
Right.
And like you telling me that made me realize, like, I don't know how many other Marthas that, that we're doing that to. And I don't know what an answer to, like, I don't, what I mean.
Well, I think part of, writing the book for me is not just to share with everybody my perspective, but for them to be able to understand what would help from the other side. So I talk about, very early on in the book about friendships and how friendships changed so much for me. And I realized that, this was probably the hardest thing that I've gone through so far in my life. And my friends who really cared and wanted to help, for many of them, it was the first time that they'd have to go through something like this. And they didn't know what to do. They didn't know, do we invite Martha to this party? Do we not invite her? Do we, offer her a drink? Do we not? And they were very uncomfortable. And that was really hard for me, is that, like, I didn't want to make people uncomfortable. And I don't sit here and tell people, like, drinking is bad. It's not, people drink socially and they enjoy it, and good for them. But what I do say is, like, be sensitive. If someone says to you, you offer them a drink and they turn you down, don't say, like, why aren't you drinking? What's the matter? And I had some of that because I was used to it. So for a while, I just chose not to go anywhere. And now what I realize, and this is what, for people who are newly sober or struggling, people don't really care what you're drinking. They don't care what you're doing. They're just there. So much of it I put on myself, so much of the pressure. But it is everywhere in society.
One of the things I was thinking about you coming is, so a lot of people might not know that Alcoholics Anonymous grew out of an Episcopal church in New York, and that so the 12 steps, I think, were written by an Episcopal priest, and so there's this idea that returning every day to the fact that you're an alcoholic is premised on the way Christians are to return every day to the news that they're a sinner in need of grace, and that the first time you forget that you're a sinner in need of grace, that's when you're about to fall off the wagon, and the first time you forget that you're an alcoholic, that's when you're about to fall off as well. And so there's this discipline of Alcoholics Anonymous that is supposed to be patterned after the discipline of discipleship. And I'm wondering what this, Exodus journey of yours, what has that done for your sense of faith and spirituality?
It's a great question. Well, first, in recovery, we say your sobriety is a daily reprieve contingent upon your spiritual condition. So when you lose that spirituality and you lose the importance of your recovery and your sobriety, that's when people slip. And I can't tell you how many times I've been around people who have had, 15, 20 years of sobriety, and they slipped and they went back out. And it's heartbreaking. But it's done so much for my faith, because I went a year on my own without really working a program or, doing anything spiritual. And I didn't drink for a year, and then I celebrated that year by popping some champagne with a friend, so that was a good plan. But this time, and it's been 5 years, a little over 5 years, I really learned that I'm not doing this by myself, that this is all thanks to being blessed by a higher power. And, I tell this story in my book about the power of prayer. And I had, years ago at a dinner party, I was probably on like my 5th martini, and sitting next to this woman who had was going through a horrible separation. And she told me the story. Her husband had gotten involved with drugs and had spent like all of their family's money, and she was beside herself. She had 4 kids, and she said, I got through it. I was like, how did you get through this? And she said, it was as if somebody or something picked me up and carried me every day, every step of the way. And I was like, okay. And I'm sure that the little green men like push your grocery cart at Safeway too. I didn't get it. I just didn't get it. And now I get it, because I'm not taking these steps by myself. It's definitely a higher power that has gotten me to where I am today, and I don't take that for granted. So spirituality has been a huge component of my recovery.
Like, it's easy to make a joke about how long it takes the Israelites to get from Egypt to Israel, because it's not very far away. Like that, this process of wandering for 40 years is, now that they're out of Egypt, God's trying to get to Egypt out of them. And so it's this long journey of exorcism almost. And I'm aware that, I have alcoholism in my family. I know Dennis's dad was an alcoholic. Without making eye contact in this room, I can think of 8 families that alcohol has ruined right now here, and more in the larger church. Like, for people who are in that spot you were in, 5+ years ago, what advice do you have for them?
Well, one thing I wanted to say about what we were just talking about is the daily reprieve, and whether you have, 4 days that you haven't picked up a drink or 40 years, it all comes down to today. And that's kind of where it relates back to the scripture with the manna. It's that God provided you with the food and nutrition that you needed for today. The only thing that separates me and my 5 years from the new person that walks in and has, maybe a week, is that split-second decision of, am I going to take this drink?
Because the manna is really, it's teaching them to trust.
Right.
Like, each day, like, it will be there just as promised.
Right. And for me, what was so overwhelming, as I said earlier, was that the whole idea that I was never going to have a drink again and never going to, have champagne at my daughter's wedding or, make a toast or go to a lacrosse tailgate.
How do you dance as a white person now?
That's a really good question. Really good question. In fact, one of my really good friends, who I don't think made it here, but one of the hardest things that I had to do was dance sober. And I said to her, I was like, I can't dance sober. And she said, Martha, you couldn't dance drunk either. So there are things you got to get used to, absolutely. But don't look at it as forever, and that's the reminder of the scripture, is just get through today. So for a new person, I can't stress enough, like, how much more beautiful my life is and how blessed I am and how grateful I am that I'm present every day. I'm here for my kids. I'm here for my husband and my friends, and it's just so much better to, it's hard. Life is hard, and we all have struggles, and mine are no different than anyone else's, but when you have a disease like alcoholism, picking up that drink is not going to do anything to help you. It's going to make things 1,000 times worse. So be comforted in the fact that you're not alone. Part of the reason for writing the book was I feel it's still such a stigma in our society, alcoholism, and there are a lot of people who are opposed to me being so vocal about it. There are a lot of people who think I should be, keep this a very private thing, and I've heard from people who said that. But you say the word alcohol and alcoholic, and people still think about, like, the bum on the street with a brown paper bag, and they don't look at a person like me, a mom sitting next to you in a PTA meeting or your kid's soccer game, and think alcoholic. I don't, scream that, but it is everywhere. There are so many people suffering, and I just want them to know, they don't have to do it alone. And if there's a way that they can turn to their faith, like I did, and turn to their higher power, and whatever that is for you. And that's the good thing about the program and about recovery, is that it's up to you as an individual what your higher power is. For me, it's God. For others, maybe it's a tree, it's Buddha, it's whatever. You just don't have to be alone, and there's plenty of help out there.
What about why humor?
Why humor?
Why?
Why did you write a book called Cancer is Funny?
I was given the title, so but why the playful angle? Where does that come from?
Because when I started writing, and I looked at this whole situation, there had been so many tears for so long, and I was like, I'm either going to move forward with tears, or I'm going to move forward and find the humor and the joy in life. And I chose that path. And it's not always easy to keep that up by any stretch of the imagination. But, who wants to pick up a book and just cry through the whole thing about, wow, what a miserable situation, and, this person has this disease and this person has cancer. Like, you have to find a way to get through it. And for me, it's with humor. So I share, in there some funny stories and some just little anecdotes, and hope that people will, everyone in this world right now needs a little more laughter.
In the church, so in the church it's called a theology of the cross, and what that is meant to convey is that, we killed God. So why pretend that we're really good people? So that, the message of the cross is that, the very worst about us has been revealed. And so we can be vulnerable, we can make jokes about ourselves, we're free to laugh at ourselves, because, there's no hiding and there's no pretending anymore. The beauty, I think, of Alcoholics Anonymous is that it allows this safe space for people to exist. The downside is that we don't get to see people kind of, making really brave choices. And so for that, I'm grateful that you're here today.
I've gone to, the first time I walked into a meeting, I was as green as this carpet and sick as a dog and scared to death. And I heard people laughing, and I was like, what is this? And to this day, when I go into a room and there's laughter, and the newcomer comes in and they're really confused. They're like, what's funny about this? But they see that, whether, again, if a person has a week of sobriety or 30 years, they're at a point where they're laughing at the beauty of life. And they want that too. They want what those people have. And as they say in AA, that they're willing to do anything to get to that point. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you all thank Martha for being here?